Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Tower of London Tea by Harney and Sons, which is flavored black tea, and I thought it was appropriate for the subject today. I'm talking about historical fiction today because this is a month where a lot of people are reading historical fiction. I actually love historical fiction. It's one of my favorite genres, so I read it as much as possible throughout the year, but I'm especially thinking about it in the month of May. And also because I just finished this, well, I recently finished this book, The Last White Rose, a novel of Elizabeth of York. I think it's got a different title in the UK, by Alison Weir. And I have thoughts. And it's not really review. I thought I'd be more of a kind of a chat about historical fiction in general regarding this particular subject and just a little bit about the book itself. I don't really intend to be spoilery. It's kind of hard to reckon with spoilers when you're talking about historical fiction because it's history. It happened. But maybe the way a particular writer frames the story, the way the points of view, their opinions are put in a certain way, dialogue is made a certain way that is not in any other book. So I guess in that way, you can be giving away something when you talk about historical fiction. Uh, I've always thought that it must be so daunting to write historical fiction. Not, maybe not as hard as writing nonfiction, because nonfiction you have to go with as much fact as possible. You can give opinion, of course. You have to obviously say that this is an opinion, otherwise you can lose the trust of your reader. But you have to go by research. You have to go by what exists and what is known. And historical fiction, you can take some liberties, but it's still difficult because you can alienate your reader if your liberties are too much of a liberty. So it can be like, for instance, a lot of people, when they write a book of the life of Elizabeth I of England, the granddaughter of this subject, by the way, a lot of people like to get to the point where Mary, Queen of Scots, was living in England as a prisoner, really, and getting close to the end, and that Elizabeth decides to visit Mary, and they have a whole conversation. This is not known to have happened, but so many people who write historical fiction like to throw that in, that if you didn't read history yourself, if you didn't do the research, if you didn't even at least look at a Wikipedia article, you might, in just conversation with someone, say, hey, it was interesting that Elizabeth and Mary had this conversation. And someone might say, we don't know that they actually did that. So, and it probably didn't happen. So where are you coming from? So you have to be careful with speculation like that. You have to be careful with the creativity end. And you also do have to be careful that you don't stray from dates too much. And if you do, like if you make something happen on, say, May the 1st, that really happened June the 1st, you gotta have a note at the end of your novel and say that, just for purposes of the story, I moved this to this time. And sometimes that's okay, because, again, it is a novel. But you have to just make sure that it doesn't take away the faith of your readers. But Elizabeth of York, like I said, I read a biography of her by the same writer, Alison Weir, and I've read other books about people of her contemporaries in which she features in occasionally, both fiction and nonfiction. And I still don't know who she was, because you can't know. Every novel will have her reacting in a different way, a slightly different way, or thinking in a slightly different way, because there is so little information that is in existence of Elizabeth's thoughts. She, of course, did not keep a journal. She didn't. If she wrote letters, very few, very, very few have survived, and a lot having to do with her beyond just everyday history that we know because she was the wife of a king, just has to do with receipts and stuff. Like she bought stuff, she had things arranged so that those are in record. So working from there is quite a challenge, especially working with this particular time period, because you're not just dealing with her, you're dealing with her uncle, Richard III. And that could be a minefield, because you are also dealing with readers who have their own opinions of what happened there, unless this is the first time they're reading of the subject, which is pretty rare at this point. Alison Weir is known to have believed, and she's written books about, well, the Princes in the Tower before, and she has come to believe that Richard III was completely responsible for the death of the princes in the tower. And I am, I know that there are people who are what they call, I think, Ricardians, Yorkists, whatever, who believe that Richard was innocent of all charges, and if he was responsible for anything, he had absolutely no choice. So he's been too vilified, and we have Thomas More to blame, and then Shakespeare, etc. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think that Richard III probably did a few things that I would not be proud of. I also think that he was stuck in a difficult position. And this book kind of explains that, while, of course, if you are very much supportive of Richard III, you will probably be disappointed by the fact that Alison Weir keeps her beliefs very much in favor of the fact that Richard III was responsible. So just as a little background, if you don't know that much about this time period, that was called, the pre-Tudor time period was known as the Wars of the Roses, because there was a constant power struggle between descendants of the King of England that all felt that they had a rightful place. And there were two main houses, families that they were all related, by the way, all of them. So family was fighting family, really. But the two main houses were the Lancastrians, Lancaster, and York. And I don't know about then so much. I don't know when the Wars of the Roses title became a thing, but the reason why they call it the Wars of the Roses is because the Lancastrians were represented by a red rose, and the York was represented by a white rose. So that's why when, spoiler alert, but not a spoiler alert because it's history, when Elizabeth of York eventually married Henry Tudor, Henry Tudor was Lancastrian, there was a combination of the roses designed by those who wanted to, show that this was finally over, and that was the Tudor rose, which, if you've ever seen it, I don't think I have a picture of it, but it's kind of pretty. And so Elizabeth was kind of in a strange position, and honestly, during this time, and like hundreds of years before, and probably hundreds of years after, being a king, a princess, whatever, did not mean that you were gonna sleep comfortably in your beds. This was a very unsettling time period. So her father was the King of England, but only by the skin of his teeth, by winning some battles. Even in her childhood, Elizabeth had to reckon with going to sanctuary with her mother and sisters, because there was threats to the throne, and they had to make sure that people weren't going to go after them. Kind of a scary time, right? But generally, Elizabeth thought she was going to be married off to a prince or a king in another land, probably France or something. But then her father died somewhat young, leaving his heirs in a very, very precarious position, because the oldest son, in those days, a woman coming to the throne was considered quite unlikely. Not illegal, but not something that people really wanted to happen, which makes it all the more remarkable that within 100 years, one of the most well-known queens of England was to come forward, which was Elizabeth's granddaughter. Well, two of Elizabeth's granddaughters really were reigning queens, but anyway, but at this point they were boys, and because Elizabeth's mother was a Woodville, which was considered an upstart family, they were not royalty. So the fact that she married Edward was something that a lot of people were not happy about, because then Edward decided to give all kinds of favors and positions to his in-laws, which is understandable to a point, but it's also like, if you really want to have peace with everybody, you may want to dial it down a little bit. So it was probably well known that a lot of people wouldn't have wanted the Woodvilles to be in power, as it were, through the next Edward, who would have been Edward V. He was only 12 years old, so it would have been easy to be the power behind that throne. Edward IV named his brother Richard, who at this point had been quite loyal to the throne, to be the protector of his son until his majority. And we'll never know if Richard would have just been cool with this and been a very nice, helpful protector with a happy ending, giving until Edward lived until his majority, got married, had some kids, and everything would have been lovely. Or would he have always been someone who would have usurped the kingship, who would have found a way to have his nephews declared and their siblings declared illegitimate and made himself next in line? We don't know, but it didn't help that the Woodvilles were slow on letting Richard know that the king was dead, to go after becoming the protector, and that opposition. And then subsequently, when Richard was able to overtake them and have the new king in his possession, as it were, under his protection, Elizabeth Woodville, the Dowager Queen, decided to take the rest of her children with her into sanctuary, which sent a bit of a message to everybody that she did not trust her brother-in-law. Maybe she was right. I mean, she seems to have been proved right after all, because then eventually Richard was able to get a hold of the younger brother. Both the brothers ended up in the tower for their supposed protection and then disappeared, never to be found alive again. There are some bodies that were found that years later that might have been them, but they haven't been tested in recent years, so there's no proof that they were those boys. That's as far as we know. And so that's why it's such a mystery, because did Richard have them killed? It's very possible that he did, and there's some justification in it, but it's really hard to see. But because they disappeared and he was not able to produce evidence that they were alive, but even that they were dead, there were so many questions, and that made his position precarious. And of course it made Elizabeth's position precarious, because technically if they were dead, technically she should have been next in line. But she was declared illegitimate. But then Richard III, lost his wife and son pretty quickly to death, and there were rumors that he was going to take Elizabeth as his wife, even though that was his niece. Let's get a dispensation from the Pope. It's going to all work out, And then later on he was like, no, I didn't really. So this book goes into what Elizabeth might have been thinking during this time. Would she have wanted it at all? Is it possible that she, maybe that wasn't her dream come true, but maybe she considered it? Did she at least think about her survival and maybe the survival of her family? Maybe to her this was the only way to be close to the throne, which was her right. But as it happens, because things ran pretty quickly in this time period. I think Richard was only 2 years the king, and there was the famous Battle of Bosworth, in which Henry Tudor comes. He was Lancastrian in his loyalties, but he was he considered himself having a right to the throne as well. But his army, his men, defeated Richard III's in battle. So really he won by battle, by combat, I guess, trial by combat, as it were. And not too long afterwards, he married Elizabeth of York. So this book, as many other books would do in this time period, gets into what Elizabeth would have felt at this time. Would she have been looking at Henry as someone who was going to rescue her? And maybe this was a very romantic feeling for her. Did she kind of look at him as maybe, Lancastrian? Technically, she was raised as a Yorkist. Was this a little bit of a tough pill to swallow? Did she feel that she had a right to be the next queen? And even though maybe she knew she didn't have the manpower to assert that, did she feel a little bit slighted? When Henry became Henry VII and she did not become Elizabeth I, she was just a queen consort. She was crowned, but still, as consort. She was not Elizabeth I. Well, we don't know in real life, but this book gets into what she might have thought, how she might have come through mentally in this situation. And then, of course, it gets into her relationship with Henry, which, slight spoiler, is a bit of a positive thing. They make her marriage to Henry VII, even though most records seem to think that they had a decent marriage, it does seem more loving than than other ways of portraying it. But also, they made Henry VII seem just slightly nicer than I've seen him usually portrayed. And his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was very, of course, instrumental in wanting her son to become king, often she is depicted as being very domineering over her daughter-in-law and being the basic power behind the throne, and just kind of relegating her daughter-in-law to, just have the babies. This one makes her a lot kinder and a lot more familial with her daughter-in-law. And in a way, I like that, because we really don't know what their actual relationship was, but sometimes you want to give everybody a chance to have a nice depiction, right? So, in the long run, I really liked it. Like I said, I don't ever really love a stance that makes Richard III to be the ultimate bad guy in any story. They didn't make him out to be horrifically nasty, but Alison Weir does justify her own feelings on the subject through this book. I thought, because sometimes Alison Weir's fiction can be a little bit over the top with certain theories. They did certain things, like, for instance, with Anne of Cleves, that I said, okay, no, that didn't happen. That just couldn't have happened. Stuff like that. But I think this one was a little bit more realistic. I'm not saying perfect. There were times where I said, yeah, no, I really don't think that's how it really would have been in behind the scenes. It was sometimes annoying because it had to be only from Elizabeth's point of view in this book, so you couldn't just have, like, meanwhile this person was having a conversation. No, it had to be that Elizabeth was in the area and she just happened to hear in a hallway, as you can sort of see depicted here. She's kind of, in a little corner there. She seems to eavesdrop on a lot of conversations, and that's how she finds out a lot of information, which sometimes I think is overdone. It's a bit Downton Abbey in that way. I mean, I love Downton Abbey, but it's a bit like, okay, every time someone's having a conversation in the hallway, someone else is listening. But I understand why that device / trope, whatever word you want to use, was used in this instance. How else would she have found out things beyond the occasional report that she might have gotten from others? But I do think it is pretty well rounded as far as what could be done with what we know about Elizabeth of York. And that's why I say I have read a number of historical fiction of the Tudor time period altogether, and some of it is really good and some of it is like eye-rolling. This is not eye-rolling. This is a good story. Sometimes I think it drags on a little bit, but I think it was a fun enough read. And so, like I said, I'm not trying to make this a review, but just in general, I did think it was a good book. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on historical fiction? Do you like it in terms of, like, getting to, I remember hearing a quote recently about something about, history books give you facts, historical fiction gives you feelings. Is that a good thing? Do we need to really do we want to make these people more flesh and blood than we see them in their, the sort of rudimentary artwork of that time period, where you may have just a general view of someone with their head covering and their like slightly pious pose or whatever. Maybe they don't seem very real to us, but they were humans, and sometimes we'll see. I mean, someone like Elizabeth, her brothers were probably killed, and then there were pretenders coming through, and there are thoughts of what she thought of them and whether she thought that they were her brothers or not, for instance. uh you know, is this something that that helps historical figures, or do you think that it damages reputation? What do you think? I hope you've enjoyed my chat. Like I said, it was a chat not based on being a professional historian or book reviewer or anything, but I thought I'd been a while since I've been on booktube, so I thought I'd just start out with a chat tea time. If you like talking about history, historical novels, and many different subjects about books and tea, please subscribe. This is Catherine taking tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.